Our reading today comes from the Gospel of Mark, the 7th chapter, a very familiar story about a mom. From there, Jesus sent out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And then Jesus said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. A mom put her career on hold to care for her infant daughter. Countless hours of feeding and bathing and changing and playing began to take their toll on her. So one night, she stubs her toe against the kitchen cabinet. She crumples to the floor in pain. Her husband swoops in and asks her where it hurts, and she looks up at him through her pain and says, "On the piggy that ate the roast beef." Remember those? Another mom spent the day chasing after 3 very active boys. Kind of sounds like my mom. And one summer evening, she's playing cops and robbers with her kids, and one of her sons points his finger at her and goes, bang! And she grasps her chest, and she falls on the ground, and she stops moving. And after a while, a neighbor who's seen this rushes over to check to see if she's okay. And she shakes her and says, "Are you okay?" And the mom opens one eye and says, "Don't give me away, just let me lie here. This is the first chance to lie down I've had in a week." Is there anything easy about being a mom? Well, I know it doesn't start out easily, right? I was there when both our kids were born, and oh my goodness. After watching our children being born, I told Kristen if she didn't do another brave thing in her whole life, having our 2 children would be enough. You know, it's been suggested that if men could have babies, childbirth would be a sacrament. Think about that. In every part of history, there are examples of courageous and persistent and determined love that moms have for their children. A story dating back to the French Revolution tells of an infantry captain and his aide walking through a town devastated by the French Revolution, not long after the rebellion had actually succeeded. They come to a burned out building, and there they find a peasant woman with her 2 children seeking shelter in the ruins. The officer directs his aide to give the woman a loaf of bread, and soon as the bread is in the mother's hand, she breaks it in half, giving one half to one of her children and the other half to the other child. The aide sees this and remarks that the woman mustn't have been very hungry. And the officer looks at him and replies that the woman didn't eat because of what she wasn't, but because of what she was, a mom. Of course, we don't have to look any further than our own Christian tradition to find plenty of examples of heroic motherhood. Think about Jesus' mom, Mother Mary, at the foot of his cross. Can any of us parents, moms or dads, imagine watching our child die on the cross? And not just any death, but the worst imaginable death I think humankind has ever devised. But there she is, to the end. Such is a mother's love. Well, that brings us to the story that we're reading today in the Gospel of Mark. This story might not pack all the emotional punch of Mother Mary at the foot of the cross, but it is an incredible story of Jesus' encounter with an unnamed mom who will stop at nothing to get help for her sick child. Not only is this encounter extremely unusual, but it illustrates the kind of love moms have for their children, the kind of love I think God has for us, and the kind of love I think God would like us to show one another. So let's have a look at what's going on here. It's important to remember that Jesus is not where we usually find him. He's out of his normal, flight pattern, if you will, because he is, in this story, outside of the Jewish homeland. Jesus mostly sticks to Jewish lands during his life and ministry, primarily to Jewish people, but this time it's different. Mark says in verse 24 that he's in the region of Tyre. That puts him up the coast in Gentile country, the Phoenician part of Syria, back in the good old days. Hence, his encounters with a Syro-Phoenician woman. And if you traveled to this part of the world today, you'd be in Lebanon. Even though Jesus is far from home, Mark lets us know his reputation extends beyond the borders of the Jewish homeland, beyond the Roman district of Palestine, because in Tyre, this foreign woman has heard about him, knows who he is, knows what he can do, knows where he is. So she tracks him down. And when she finds him, that's when the story gets very, very interesting. She begs him, as we would expect, for Jesus to help her sick daughter, to cast the demon out of her, to make her well. So far, so good. But what do you think of Jesus' response? He says to her in verse 27, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Now tell me that doesn't sound like Jesus is completely blowing this woman off, and if that weren't bad enough, throwing in a slur in the bargain. I mean, it sounds very insulting. There's no way around that. I mean, he's kind of referring to this woman as a dog, isn't he? Well, not really. It's true that Jews of Jesus' day refer to non-Jews in general and to Romans in particular as dogs. And if you're thinking they don't do this as a compliment, you're absolutely right. It's an extremely derisive term that was never meant in a complimentary way. So what's Jesus doing here? Is he really responding to this woman's earnest desire to have him help her sick child by means of a racial slur? Is that what's going on here? Is he throwing her problem back in her face, refusing to help her daughter simply because they're not Jews? Well, I admit it kind of sounds like he is. But if you dig down underneath just a little bit, he really isn't. What Jesus is doing here is making fun of the Jews' widely known opinion of non-Jews. It's even possible he is intentionally mangling an anti-Gentile slogan that was in use at the time. Now, we've all heard of, damnation with faint praise, right? Here, I think Jesus is doing something akin to that. He's deflating a racial stereotype by greatly overstating it. It's like he's saying, I couldn't possibly help you, me, a Jew, and you, a Gentile. I mean, what would the neighbors say? That's kind of the feeling that this statement of Jesus's kind of comes across with. And this much, I think, would have come across to anybody who heard it, because they're all conversant in the Jew and Gentile thing going on during the first century. But what happens next is even more incredible than this exchange. The unnamed Gentile mother obviously gets a sense of what Jesus is doing, right? She understands Jesus by blowing holes in what could have otherwise been, an impenetrable racial roadblock. She understands that Jesus is kind of welcoming her into conversation. He's inviting her into a little dialogue, into a theological conversation, no less. This just doesn't happen. This is a weird, unusual, almost unthinkable thing to have happen in the first century. It doesn't happen because Jewish men do not address Jewish women who aren't part of their family. So it's not like you walk up and down the street, tipping your hat and saying, good morning, ma'am, good morning. No. If you weren't related, you didn't even acknowledge them. That was considered, an unpardonable social sin. So imagine what people are thinking when Jesus, a Jewish rabbi, talks to a non-Jewish female. This is scandalous. It doesn't come across in the text, but it is. Nothing in either of their cultures, Jew or Gentile, would allow for anything like this to happen. And yet, it's happening. Between Jesus and this mom, it's happening. And it's her interactions with Jesus that frame some important lessons, I think, for us even today. This woman shows love for her daughter with very compelling words. Her words are unmatched by anybody who ever said anything to Jesus. A Gentile woman, her direct speech to Jesus after being invited to do so is far and beyond anything anybody says to Jesus in the entire New Testament. And as soon as she understands that Jesus is inviting her into a once-in-a-lifetime conversation, she proves herself equal to the task, to Jesus' initial and feigned objection to helping her. She replies in verse 28, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." So her words so perfectly kind of parry Jesus' opening words to her that you sense in his reply something approaching bemused delight. In verse 29, he says to her, listen carefully, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." Now, by the way, I think it's worth saying that some manuscripts show her addressing Jesus as Lord instead of Sir. So you can take your pick. Did she say Sir, or did she say Lord? And that makes her the only person in the entire Gospel of Mark that addresses Jesus as Lord. His family doesn't do that. His disciples don't do that. Only this unnamed Gentile mom calls Jesus what he really is, Lord. The point is, this mom's love for her daughter comes through in how she speaks with Jesus, but that's not the only way it comes through. It also comes through for the attitude she brings to this conversation. From the way her conversation begins with Jesus, it's not hard to imagine all the other ways this conversation might have gone. One way in particular, and that is her skulking off in defeat and humiliation. Why doesn't it end that way? It doesn't end that way because this mom approaches Jesus with the single determination to help her daughter. She believes Jesus can and is willing to help her. And I think Jesus picks this up. Right like that. She was not to be turned away, but neither was she spoiling for a fight. She wasn't in it to win anything for herself. She was only there to benefit her daughter. And she was able to express her love for her daughter through the attitude of resolute persistence and absolute confidence that Jesus could do for her daughter what nobody else could. And this Jesus honors. Then this Gentile mom puts her love to work. She doesn't just feel love for her daughter, which of course she has, but she acts on this love in some pretty incredible ways. A week or so back, we talked about how the notion of love in the Bible isn't what we commonly think it is. When we think of love, we normally think of, Valentine's Day and, romantic love, and that's part of it. But in the Bible, love is not an emotion. It is nothing you feel. Love is something you do. And this woman portrays love through her actions as well as anybody in the Bible. We've already talked about some not so nice feelings the Jews have for Gentiles. Well, that door swings both ways. The Greek influence background of this woman might have resulted in her never even thinking to approach Jesus, or at least to approach him as an inferior, because many Gentiles of the time looked at Jews, especially Jews from Galilee like Jesus was, as kind of hillbillies, as kind of backwood hicks, kind of rough and unsophisticated, and in their belief in only one God, kind of extremist. But she doesn't do that. She not only approaches Jesus, but she throws herself at his feet and begs for his help. This is a very common first century Eastern Mediterranean way of showing that I am, you are above me and I'm asking you for a favor. It's a way of entreating. It's a way of begging for help. So whatever she thought or felt as she lay at Jesus' feet is beyond what is evident in her actions. But we know that what she's doing is in service of making her daughter better. So here we have a picture of one mother's love for a child. It's apparent in her words. It's apparent in her attitude. It's known in her actions on that day so long ago, when she sought out Jesus to do for her daughter what she believed only he could do. She ignored a lot of social rules to get to Jesus. She put aside whatever fears of rejection she might have worried about. She was willing to endure sacrifice and rejection and public humiliation. She even looked beyond what many would have thought a slight to engage Jesus in a conversation that ultimately results in her daughter receiving exactly what her mom wanted. And for these reasons, the story is a good story of a mother's love as any, I think. And this woman faced every challenge. She defeated every obstacle for her daughter. And I think we can take, an example from this and give thanks that moms still operate this way. They love persistently and powerfully and courageously for no other reason than we are their children, right? This is a good story of God's love for us as any as well. God's love is like a mother's love. I mean, the Bible comes right out and says it. Jesus says as he's looking over Jerusalem, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who slay the prophets and kill those sent to you, how often would I have gathered you like a mother hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you wouldn't let me." So even Jesus talks about God's love in feminine, motherly, I guess you'd say, imagery. Because God's love is like mom's love, right? It's strong and steady, sacrificial, dependable. It lets nothing stand in its way. The story of our faith is God loving us so much that he was willing to give away the life of his only son so he could give life to us. And just like the Syrophoenician's mother's love is not to be put off, so is God's love for you and me. This is an example, I would argue, of love at its very best. And here we see a love that truly is willing to bear all things, believe all things, hope all things, endure all things. I was lucky enough to have a mom who loved me like that. I was lucky enough to have a mom who loved me in spite of and through a lot of tough times. Like I mentioned, my mother was a mom of 3 very different, very active, sort of wild sons, but who never gave up on any of them, who always wanted the best for them, and in the end saw myself and my 2 brothers through to better things ahead. I was lucky to have a mom like that. And I know not all of us are that lucky. But all of us are lucky enough to be loved that way by God. Now imagine what the world would be like if each of us started to share that same kind of strong, unconquerable love that this mom shows for her child, that God shows for us. Just imagine that for a second. What kind of a world would we have that's different from the world we have now? As we today give thanks for our moms, I want you to think about that, would you? What word could you speak? What attitude could you adopt? What action could you take to contribute to our world being a more loving, caring, understanding place? Who is it in your life who needs to hear a word of love? Who is it in your life who needs to know that that kind of strong and unconquerable and unstoppable love is working for them as well as the other guy? And who here isn't in need of God's love to do for us every day what this mom is willing to do for her child? Loving this way is a tall order. It ain't easy. And any of us who've tried to love through somebody's objections or past, an obstacle knows that this kind of love is big league kind of love. And maybe the thought of God's love is sometimes too big to grasp and emulate. But thank God we don't have to. We have the example of the Syrophoenician's mother's love, or our mother's love, or any mother's love, to remember and to resemble. And thank God, that example is almost always more than enough love than we could need for this Syrophoenician's mother's child and for all of us kids. Hearing the gospel, I ask you to respond to it with me, praying the prayer that Jesus taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen.